The day Catherine Fletcher walked into the Abilene cattle market with nothing but her pride, 2 daughters, and a herd of 32 scrawny longhorns, she was fully prepared to be swindled, and she had already decided she would not cry about it. It was the spring of 1873, and Abilene, Kansas was still humming with the kind of restless energy that followed the Kishom Trail north like a shadow. The town smelled of livestock and sawdust and ambition, and the market square on the eastern edge of town was packed with ranchers, buyers, trail bosses, and speculators who had all come with money in their pockets and intention in their eyes. The morning sun was already fierce, burning off the last of the April dew, and the crowd moved in waves around the pens and corrals, voices rising and falling over the lowing of cattle and the occasional sharp whistle of a drover. Catherine stood at the entrance to the market grounds with her older daughter, Nora, who was 12 and already had her mother's stubborn set to her jaw, and her younger daughter, me, who was 8 and clutched a rag doll with one hand and her sister's sleeve with the other. Catherine was 31 years old, and she had the kind of face that had once been purely lovely and was now something better weathered into a striking combination of bone structure and conviction. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a faded bonnet, and her dress, though clean, had been mended at both elbows and the hem. She carried herself like someone who had learned that a straight spine was the one luxury she could always afford. Her husband, Thomas Fletcher, had died 8 months ago. Fever. It had come on fast and finished quickly, the way cruel things often do, and it had left Catherine with 60 acres of dry Texas soil, a mortgage that wasn't quite drowning her but was doing its best, a small herd of cattle that Thomas had been building for 3 years, and 2 daughters who still sometimes woke up calling for their father in the night. She had managed through the fall and the winter by sheer force of will and the help of a neighboring family named Prout, who were kind people but had their own troubles. By March, she had understood with complete clarity that she could not keep the herd through another lean season. She needed the money. She needed it to pay down the mortgage, to buy seed, to carry them through to next year when the land might finally give something back. She had driven the cattle up herself with the help of an old hired man named Virgil who had worked for Thomas and who refused to be paid anything more than his meals for the journey. He was 63 and half deaf, and the most reliable person she had ever met. He had the cattle in the pen now, and he was standing beside them with his battered hat pulled low, watching the crowd with the wariness of a man who had seen too many markets and too many men who knew how to make an honest person feel foolish. Catherine squared her shoulders and walked into the market. She knew what she would face. She had heard it from women in town, had read the shape of it in the way men's eyes moved over her when she arrived, the quick calculation, the assumption that a widow with cattle was a woman who could be managed. The legitimate buyers would lowball her. The speculators would circle. Someone would explain the market to her as though she hadn't spent the last 3 years listening to Thomas talk about nothing else. Someone would make her an offer that was insulting and present it with a kind smile, and she would have to decide whether to take it or wait, and waiting meant another night on the road, another day of feed, another day of Nora and me sleeping in the wagon. She had done the math 100 times on the journey north. A fair price for the grade of cattle she was selling was somewhere between $18 and $22 a head. She would take 16 if she had to. She would not take less than that. She had a number fixed in her mind like a nail driven into wood, and she held it there as she moved through the crowd toward the registration table. The man at the registration table was a heavy-set fellow with a ledger and ink-stained fingers who barely looked at her as she gave her name and the count of her herd. He wrote it down, assigned her a pen number, and told her bidding for her lot would happen mid-morning. She thanked him and moved away, and she did not miss the way he glanced at the man beside him after she walked off, a small look of shared amusement, the kind of look that people think is invisible. She found a spot near the fence where she could watch the early bidding and get a sense of the prices moving through the market. Nora stood beside her with her arms crossed, watching everything with the same dark eyes as her mother. Mee had discovered a cat sitting on a fence post and was attempting a negotiation with it. The prices in the early lots were better than Catherine had hoped. A solid herd of mixed-grade longhorns went for $19 a head. Another lot of similar quality went for $20. She felt something loosen slightly in her chest, a tension she had been carrying so long she had almost stopped noticing it. That was when she first saw Marshall Boone. He was standing across the auction floor with a group of other men, but he was not quite part of the group in the way that people who belong somewhere are part of a thing. He stood slightly apart, with the easy stillness of a man who was comfortable in his own company. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, probably 35 or 36 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had several days of dark beard on it. He wore a plain dark coat over a work shirt, and his boots were good leather, well-maintained, the boots of a man who took care of his tools. His hat was pushed back slightly on his head, and he was watching the auction with an expression of calm attention that somehow made him look more focused than the men around him who were visibly excited. Catherine noted him the way she noted most things in a crowd, quickly, practically, filing away information without sentimentality. He was large enough to be useful in a fight and quiet enough to be interesting. That was all she let herself think before she turned her attention back to the auction floor. She did not know who he was. She would learn later that Marshall Boone was one of the most respected cattle buyers in Kansas, that he had a ranch north of Abilene that he had built from nothing over the past decade, that he was known throughout the territory for paying fair prices and never arguing a deal once it was struck, and that he was, in the carefully worded assessments of everyone who knew him, a man of absolute and sometimes inconvenient integrity. She did not know any of this yet. She only knew that when her lot number was called and she walked to the edge of the auction floor with Virgil beside her, the morning had grown hot and the crowd had thinned somewhat, but was still large enough that she could hear the collective attention of it shift as the auctioneer called out her pen number and the details of her herd. She had 32 head, mixed-grade longhorns, thin from the trail but healthy. She had made sure of that, had driven them slowly and carefully, had made certain they were watered and not pushed past what they could sustain. The auctioneer described the lot in the standard rapid cadence of his trade, and Catherine stood at the fence and felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward her and make its quiet, invisible judgment. The first bid came from a man she had already identified as trouble, a buyer named Gills who operated a feeding operation east of town and who was known, she had been told by Virgil, for snapping up widow sales at the lowest possible price. He bid $13 a head, and he said it with the pleasant confidence of a man who expected the number to land and stay there. $13. Catherine felt the number like a cold hand on her arm. That was not enough. That was not close to enough. The auctioneer called for additional bids, and there was a brief silence of the kind that felt deliberate, the silence of men who have agreed without speaking to let a number sit. And then from across the floor, in a voice that was not loud but carried in a way that made the crowd pay attention without quite knowing why, came a different number. $22 a head, full price, top of the morning's market, no hesitation, no preface, no performance. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. Catherine turned her head. She knew where to look without knowing how she knew it. Across the floor, the tall man with the dark coat and the pushed-back hat was looking not at her but at the auctioneer, his expression entirely unchanged, as though he had simply stated a mathematical fact and was waiting for the world to catch up. Gills made a counteroffer, $23, delivered with the smile of a man who was enjoying a game. Marshall Boone looked at Gills with an expression of complete composure and said, in that same carrying voice, $24. Gills's smile shifted slightly. He looked at Boone, then at the cattle in the pen, then back at Boone, with the calculating attention of a man running numbers and finding them inconvenient. $24 for this grade of stock was above the morning's prices. It made no practical sense as a business decision. Gills knew it, and from the murmur moving through the crowd, everyone else knew it too. Gills did not counter. The auctioneer, after a pause that held its breath for the entire market, brought down his gavel. $24 a head, 32 head, Catherine Fletcher's herd. Catherine stood very still for a moment. The number was moving through her mind like water through a dry channel, filling every space, reaching every corner. $24 multiplied by 32 head. It was more than she had dared to calculate for, more than her most optimistic figure on those late nights doing sums by lamplight at the kitchen table. It was enough. It was more than enough. It cleared the mortgage and left a cushion, and meant that this year, for the first time in 2 years, she might be able to breathe. She turned to look at the man who had bid, intending to meet his eyes, to at minimum acknowledge what had just happened. But Marshall Boone had already turned away from the floor and was speaking to another buyer about something else entirely, and he did not look back. Virgil, standing at her shoulder, made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a chuckle. "Well," he said, and left it at that. Catherine stood with the number ringing in her head and watched Marshall Boone's broad back as he moved through the crowd, and she thought that she did not understand what had just happened, and she thought that she needed to find out. The transaction was completed at the market office, a small, crowded building at the edge of the grounds where deals were registered, and money changed hands through a clerk who had a green eyeshade and a suspicious nature. Catherine signed the paperwork with the hand that was not entirely steady, accepted the payment draft from the clerk, and folded it carefully into her dress pocket. Nora, who had watched the entire auction from the fence with an attention that Catherine found both gratifying and slightly unnerving in a 12-year-old, fell into step beside her as she came out of the office. "Who was that man?" Nora asked. "I don't know," Catherine said. "He paid more than the other man was going to." "I know." "Why?" "I don't know that either," Catherine said, and she was aware that this was one of the few times in recent memory that she had said she didn't know something twice in a row. Me appeared from somewhere, cat-less and philosophically unbothered by it, and took her mother's hand. The three of them made their way back through the market grounds toward the wagon where Virgil was already beginning to settle the horses for the midday rest. Catherine was looking for Marshall Boone. She was doing it carefully, without making it obvious, because she was aware that her interest could be misread, and she was not prepared to have it misread. She told herself she simply wanted to thank him, which was true. She told herself there was nothing beyond that, which was partially true and partially something she was not quite ready to examine. She did not find him that morning. They stayed in Abilene that night, at a modest boarding house on the main street that smelled of pine soap and boiled vegetables, and was run by a woman named Mrs. Hartley, who had a gift for making small spaces feel secure. Catherine paid for 2 nights without flinching, because she could afford it now, and the luxury of paying for something without flinching was so novel that she had to stop herself from doing it again just to feel the sensation twice. Nora and me shared a narrow bed, and were asleep within 10 minutes of lying down. Catherine sat by the window of their room with the lamp turned low and looked at the street below, and thought about the next steps with the mechanical precision that had become her primary way of managing grief. Keep moving, keep planning, keep your eye on the next thing, because if you stop moving you might feel everything that is waiting for you and it might be too large to survive. She had the money. She would send a payment to the bank on Monday. She would buy seed on the way back south. She would talk to Virgil about whether the south pasture was worth fencing this year or whether it should wait. She would get home and she would keep going because that was what she did, that was who she had become. She thought briefly and against her will about Thomas, about the way he had smelled in the morning like sleep and cedar and something warm, about the way he had talked about the future as though it were a country he was planning to visit and had already bought the ticket for, about the 8 months since, which had been the longest 8 months of her life. She stopped herself. She turned her mind to the draft in her pocket. She focused on what was real. She did not think about Marshall Boone. She was very deliberate about that. The next morning she went to the market to settle some final paperwork with the clerk and to pick up a receipt for the transaction, and she turned a corner behind the market office and nearly walked directly into Marshall Boone. He was taller up close. She had to tilt her head slightly to look at him, which she did not do often, being not a short woman. He was carrying a folded paper in one hand and had his hat in the other, which somehow made him look simultaneously more imposing and more approachable, and he looked at her with dark eyes that were entirely direct without being aggressive. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said. It was not a question, but it held the cadence of something careful. She stopped. "Yes, and you are Marshall Boone, I'm told." He nodded one short movement. "The clerk mentioned your name when I filed the purchase." "Then you have an advantage over me. I didn't learn your name until last night when Virgil told me." She looked at him steadily. "I came to find you yesterday to thank you. I couldn't locate you. I had business to attend to." She waited, because she sensed that if she filled the silence he would let her, and that would be a mistake. She wanted to understand something. She wanted to know what the $24 bid had been, and she was not going to be satisfied with a polite deflection. After a moment he said, "Your cattle were a fair lot." The market was moving well. The cattle were thin from the drive, she said, because she was not going to pretend otherwise. And the first bidder offered 13. "You paid almost double." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, not guilt, not discomfort, but something that was perhaps the beginning of respect for a person who said the true thing instead of the convenient one. "Yes," he said. "Why?" Another pause. He turned his hat in his hands once, a single rotation. "Because the price was fair, because 13 wasn't. You know who I am. You know I'm a widow driving cattle alone. With your daughters and an old hired man, yes. So was this charity." The word landed between them like something she had set down carefully and was watching to see what he would do with it. His expression did not change except for a slight tightening around the eyes that she would come to recognize, months later, as the face he made when he was choosing his words with particular care. "No," he said. "It was a business transaction. I needed the cattle. I paid what I thought they were worth, that's all." She studied him. She was very good at reading people. Years of managing Thomas's social hesitations and navigating market relationships had given her a finely calibrated sense of when someone was performing honesty versus actually being honest. Marshall Boone, she thought, was telling a version of the truth. He had needed cattle, he had paid fair. But the $24 number, the deliberate counter against Gill's, the unhesitating jump above market, those were choices that went beyond pure business calculation, and she thought he knew she knew it, and she thought that was perhaps why he was not elaborating. "Well," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Boone. It made a material difference." "I expect it did," he said, without sentiment, and she found herself thinking that a man who neither minimized the significance of a thing nor made a performance of it was a rarer creature than she had given the world credit for producing. She moved to step past him. He shifted slightly to give her room, and then, as she passed him, he said, "Mrs. Fletcher." She stopped. "If you drive cattle north again, the market is fair here in the fall. There's a September auction." She looked back at him. "I'll keep that in mind." She walked away, and she did not look back. She was completely aware of whether he watched her go, and he did, and she told herself it did not matter, and she told herself she would not think about it, and she spent the entire walk back to the boarding house thinking about it. They left Abilene 2 days later, the wagon pointing south toward Texas, Virgil on the seat beside her with his hat pulled over his eyes half the time and his eyes scanning the horizon the other half, Nora reading a school primer in the wagon bed, me asleep with her head on a folded blanket. The Kansas plains stretched out in every direction, still green from the spring rains, the sky enormous and slightly theatrical in the way that plain skies tend to be, as though the horizon is showing off. Catherine drove and thought about numbers and plans and seed prices, and she thought about her land, which she loved with the kind of passionate and complicated love that you develop for a thing that has also made you suffer. And she did not think about Marshall Boone until they were 3 hours south of Abilene, at which point she thought about him for approximately 45 minutes, and then made a decision that it was foolish and impractical and stopped. The summer of 1873 was hard and good in turns, the way Texas summers tended to be. She planted the south field with corn and the kitchen garden with everything she could manage, and she hired a young man named Pete Dawes from the neighboring settlement to help with the heavier work, because Virgil's back had begun to trouble him, and she was not going to let him injure himself on her account. Pete was 20 and enthusiastic, and not particularly skilled but willing to learn, and by July he had become a useful presence on the property. Nora and me went to school in the fall, riding the 4 miles to town on the one good horse that Catherine kept for them, taking turns. Nora was reading at a level that made the schoolteacher write Catherine a note suggesting she might benefit from more advanced material, and Catherine had sat with that note for an evening and felt the complicated pride of a parent who wants everything for her child and is aware of every obstacle. She wrote to the bank about Nora's education. She wrote to a women's organization in San Antonio that she had read about in a newspaper, which operated a lending library for frontier families. She wrote letters in the evenings after the girls were asleep, at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, because she had decided that she was going to build this life properly, not just survive it. She did not write to Marshall Boone, because there was no reason to write to Marshall Boone. In September, she received a letter from a cattle buyer in Abilene, not Marshall Boone, a different man, inquiring whether she planned to bring a herd to the fall market. She had 9 head that were ready, a smaller lot than the spring drive, but worth the journey if the prices held. She wrote back saying yes. She told herself it was purely practical. She drove north again in late September with Pete Dawes alongside her, and the girls left in the care of Mrs. Prout from the neighboring farm, and she arrived in Abilene on an overcast Tuesday morning when the light was flat and the air smelled like the beginning of autumn. She registered her lot, was assigned a PIN number, and found her spot at the auction fence. She was not looking for Marshall Boone. He was standing at the far corner of the market, and he saw her at approximately the same moment she saw him, which she noticed because his attention changed in a way that was very slight and would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't watching for exactly that kind of change. He did not wave. He did not call across the crowd. He simply looked at her for a moment, and then he walked across the market floor toward her with the unhurried purpose of a man who has decided to do something and is going to do it. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, reaching her, "you drove up again. I said I might. You said you'd keep it in mind." Something in the way he said it suggested he found the precision amusing, though his expression remained largely composed. "I kept it in mind and then came," she said. 9 head this time. "The fall market is smaller. The prices are steadier," he said. "Less speculation in the fall. You're more likely to get a consistent number." "That's what I thought." They stood side by side at the fence in the way of 2 people who have just run out of practical conversation and are negotiating what comes next. The auction was beginning with a different lot, a large herd from a ranch further north, and the auctioneer's rapid cadence filled the space between them. "Are you staying in Abilene long?" he asked. "One night. I need to be back." "The girls are well," she glanced at him. "You remember I have daughters." "I remember everything about that conversation," he said, and then he appeared to consider whether he had said more than he intended, and she watched him decide that he had and that he was going to let it stand anyway. "How are they?" "Nora is reading everything she can find. Mi has decided she wants to learn to ride properly, which has led to some negotiation." She paused. "They're well. They miss their father." "Of course they do." "And I do," she said, because she wanted to say it, because she thought it was important to be honest about what she was and was not, where she was in the geography of grief. "I want to be clear about that." He looked at her with those direct dark eyes and said, "I wouldn't expect otherwise. Some men make assumptions about widows, about what they need or want or are available for. I'm not some men." "No," she said, after looking at him for a moment. "I don't believe you are." They stood in silence for a while and watched the auction, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that two people share when they are in the same place and thinking about each other in a way that they are not yet ready to name. Her lot sold that afternoon for $18 a head, which was fair and steady and nothing remarkable, and the buyer was a man from a feeding operation east of town who examined the cattle professionally and shook her hand at the end like she was a person, which she marked as a point in his favor. That evening she was coming out of the general store with a length of yard goods for a dress she had promised me, and Marshall Boone was crossing the street from the direction of the bank, and they arrived at the same corner of the boardwalk at the same time. He stopped. She stopped. "Have you eaten supper?" he asked. "Not yet. There's a decent dining room at the hotel on 2nd Street, better than the boarding house kitchen." She looked at him carefully. She thought about what it would mean to have supper with a man in Abilene, what it would look like, what she thought about it herself, what she was prepared to do with the information that she had been thinking about this specific man with a frequency that she found inconvenient. "All right," she said. The hotel dining room was warm and properly lit and smelled like roasted meat and bread, and the tablecloth was white and only slightly worn at the corners. They sat across from each other and ordered from a small menu, and Catherine took off her bonnet and set it on the empty chair beside her and felt, for one strange moment, as though she had set down something heavier than a hat. They talked for 3 hours. She had not expected that. She had expected the careful small talk of people who are circling something delicate, and there was some of that, but it gave way quickly to something more direct and more interesting. She discovered that Marshall Boone had come to Kansas from Missouri 15 years ago with $4 and a horse that he subsequently had to sell for feed, and had spent 4 years working other men's cattle before he had enough money to lease a small parcel of land, and 4 more years after that before he could buy it. She discovered that he was 36 years old and had never married, which she did not ask about directly, but which came out in the natural movement of the conversation, and which he offered without drama. She discovered that he had a younger sister in Missouri who wrote him letters that he answered with what he described as inadequate regularity, and that he read when he could, and that he had opinions about the Homestead Act that were complicated and interesting, and that he found the politics of the cattle market, the collusions and the speculations and the deliberate maneuvering, genuinely distasteful in a way that had clearly cost him money, and that he had apparently decided was worth it. She told him about Texas, about the 60 acres, which had been Thomas's inheritance and which she had come to love in a way that still surprised her. About the corn she had planted this year and the kitchen garden and Pete Dawes and his enthusiasm. About Nora, who she worried about in the way you worry about a child who is smarter than her circumstances. About me, who seemed constitutionally incapable of distress, and whose cheerfulness Catherine sometimes found both sustaining and inexplicable. She did not tell him very much about Thomas, because that was too deep and she was not ready, but she mentioned him as a fact, a person who had been there and was now not, whose absence had changed the shape of everything. Marshall listened without trying to fix it, which she noticed. "You've managed something significant," he said when she had described the past 8 months. "Most people, when something knocks the foundation out, it takes them a long time to find their footing. I didn't have time for a long time," she said. "The girls needed," she paused. "Everything needed to keep going, so I kept it going. That's not a small thing." "No," she said, "it's not." He looked at her across the table with an expression that she couldn't entirely classify. It had gravity to it, and something warmer than admiration, and she felt it land on her in a way that was different from anything she had felt in a long time, different enough that she found it slightly alarming. She walked back to the boarding house afterward, and he walked with her to the door, and at the door he said, "Mrs. Fletcher," and she said, "I think you can call me Catherine." And he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Catherine," and somehow her name in his voice was a different word than she was used to. "Good night, Marshall," she said, because it seemed only fair. She went up to her room and sat by the window in the dark and felt something large and complicated moving through her, something she didn't have a name for yet or wasn't ready to name. It was not simple, and it was not comfortable, and it was absolutely not practical. She thought, this is probably the beginning of something. And then she thought, I am not sure I am ready for that. She went to sleep without resolving either of those thoughts, which was the most honest thing she could do with them. She drove south the next morning with Pete Dawes quiet on the seat beside her, because he had learned to read her moods with the accuracy of someone who wanted to keep his job. And she was quiet all through Kansas and into the Oklahoma territory, and only began to talk normally again when Texas opened up before them, and the land smelled like home. She got a letter in November. It was written on good paper in a hand that was straightforward and legible without being elegant, and it said, Catherine, I hope the drive back went without incident, and that your girls are well. I had occasion to be in Abilene again last week to finalize some paperwork and found myself thinking I should have asked you before you left whether you intended to come back to the spring market. I would like to know. Also, I found a book you might consider for your Nora. The school teacher here recommended it for advanced readers. I've enclosed the title in case you know how to get hold of it. Yours, Marshall Boone. She read it twice and then read it again. Then she set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. She wrote back. She said the drive had been fine. She said the girls were well. She said she expected she would come to the spring market, as the herd was building, and she hoped to have a better number by April. She said she had found the book at the lending library she had managed to get access to through the women's organization in San Antonio, so Nora was set. She said she had been thinking about what he'd said about the fall prices being more consistent, and she thought he was right, and she had some thoughts about the timing of future drives that she would value his opinion on. She did not say, I have read your letter 4 times and I have thought about you more days than I have not thought about you since September. She did not say, I had dinner with you once and it felt like something I had been missing for a long time without knowing exactly what I was missing. She did not say any of that. She sent the letter and went to bed and woke up in the morning and managed her land and her daughters and her life with the practical devotion that was her primary mode of being in the world. He wrote back, she wrote back, he wrote back again. The letters were not love letters. They were letters between two careful people who were telling each other the true things about their lives, the practical things, the daily things, the occasional opinion on larger matters, and who were, in the process of that honest telling, building something that was more substantial than either of them was quite ready to call by its right name. By January, she knew that she looked forward to his letters with an anticipation that was entirely disproportionate to their content, and she knew that she spent too long composing her replies, and she knew that his name in her mind had changed its character. It was no longer just a name attached to a man she had met. It was something that occupied a specific and significant location in her internal landscape, and she knew what that meant. And she was frightened of it in the way that people are frightened of things they want very badly. Thomas had died. Thomas, who she had loved for 7 years, who she had built a life with and raised children with and planned a future with, was gone. And to love someone again felt both like a possibility she deserved and a betrayal she would have to negotiate with herself at length. She talked to Nora about it, carefully, obliquely, one evening in January when Me was asleep and the kitchen was warm. Nora, who was 12 years old and had her mother's clarity, said, Is this about the man from Abilene? Catherine stared at her daughter. What do you mean? You've gotten letters from Abilene 3 times since September. You always read them by yourself. And you looked different after you read them. Different how? Nora considered. Like you remembered something you'd forgotten, the good kind of remembering. Catherine was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Your father would always be your father. I know that, Nora said with the patient practicality of someone who has had 8 months to accept a fact. I'm not worried about that, are you? I'm thinking about it. Well, Nora said, She got up and kissed Catherine on the cheek, which she did not do often, being 12 and therefore in permanent negotiation with sentimentality. "Think faster. You look better when you're reading those letters." Catherine sat in the kitchen for a long time after Nora went to bed, and she thought. She thought about Thomas and about grief, and about the way love is not a finite resource that gets used up, but a renewable one, a thing that can grow in more than one direction without diminishing what was already there. She thought about Marshall Boone, who had bid $24 a head on her cattle without hesitation and said nothing else, who had walked across a market floor to speak to her in September as though it were the most natural thing in the world, who wrote her letters about cattle prices and book titles and his sister in Missouri, who looked at her as though she were entirely worth looking at. She picked up her pen and she wrote him a letter that was different from the others. She told him about Nora's question. She told him she had been thinking over these months about what the letters meant and what the September dinner had meant, and whether she was ready to say what she thought those things added up to. She told him she was uncertain, not because she was unclear about her own feelings, but because she was still navigating the space between who she had been and who she was becoming. She told him she thought she might be able to drive north in February if he was going to be in Abilene, and if he was, she would like to have that supper again. She sealed the letter. She sent it. Then she felt entirely exposed for 2 weeks while she waited for his reply, which she spent managing her exposed feeling by working very hard and being very organized about the spring planting schedule. His reply came on a Wednesday. It was slightly longer than his usual letters, and the handwriting was the same straightforward hand, but she noticed, in the way she noticed his letters, that the words came more quickly than they usually did, as though he had written this one with less deliberation and more urgency. He said he had read her letter 3 times. He said he appreciated that she said the true thing instead of the comfortable one, because he had been trying to do the same and was not always certain he was succeeding. He said that he had thought about her, specifically, consistently, with more frequency and more warmth than he knew how to be casual about, and that he had been uncertain how to say that without alarming her, and that her letter had made it clear that alarm was not what she needed, so he was saying it directly. He said he would be in Abilene in February, or he would make himself be in Abilene in February, and that he would like very much to have that supper, and he would like very much to see her. She read the letter and felt something that was warm and large and entirely her own. She wrote back. She said she would come. February in Kansas was cold in a way that Texas didn't quite prepare you for, a dry, clean, bone-deep cold that made the air feel brittle and the light look like something from a painting. She drove north with Pete Dawes again and arrived in Abilene on a Thursday afternoon, and before she had even reached the boarding house, she saw Marshall Boone coming out of the feed store, and he saw her at the same moment. He walked to her. She had stopped the wagon, and he came to the side of it, and he looked up at her with the winter light on his face, and she looked down at him, and there was a moment of complete stillness between them in which everything that had been accumulating across 8 months of letters and 2 conversations and too many sleepless nights arrived at a single point and held there, like a breath before a word. "You came," he said. "I said I would. You did." He helped her down from the wagon, which she didn't need but accepted, and his hand around hers was warm in the cold air, and she held it for a moment longer than was necessary for the purpose of descending from a wagon, and he did not let go first. They had supper that evening, and this time the conversation went to different places. She told him about Thomas, the real things, the deep ones, the way Thomas had loved this land that had eventually been part of what killed him, working through a fever he wouldn't admit he had because there was too much to do. She told him about the first months without him, which she had managed and survived, and which she was not going to pretend had been anything other than devastating. She told him she was not looking to replace something, that she didn't think in those terms, that what she was saying, obliquely and imprecisely, was that she was herself, and she was available for something new if it was the right thing. He listened. He did not try to offer comfort that would be hollow or perspective that would be presumptuous. He just listened, which was the right thing to do, and she recognized it as such, and it mattered to her. Then he said that he wanted to be honest with her about something, and she said go ahead. And he said that he had watched her at the spring market 8 months ago for a few minutes before the bidding, had watched the way she stood, and the way she looked at the crowd, and the way she was preparing herself for whatever was coming, and he had thought then that she was the most composed and privately fierce person he had seen in a long time. And he had bid on her cattle because the first bid was insulting, and because he could afford to pay what was fair, and he had told himself that was purely what it was, a business decision rooted in principle, and he had told himself that for about 3 days, before he admitted to himself that he had also done it because she was exactly the kind of person he would want to help without making her feel helped, if that made any sense at all. It made complete sense. She told him so. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and the dining room continued around them in its ordinary way with no awareness that something significant was happening at the corner table, which was fine. Some things did not need witnesses. She stayed in Abilene 4 days, which was more than she had planned. She drove out to Marshall's ranch north of town on the 2nd day, because he asked her if she would like to see it, and she said yes. The ranch was substantial, more than she had imagined, a solid house of good lumber, a large barn, several outbuildings, good fencing, and beyond it the land that he had been building for a decade. It was covered in winter brown, but she could see the shape of what it would be in spring, and she understood the way he talked about it, the same kind of complicated love she had for her own 60 acres, the attachment of a person who has put their own effort into the soil and come to feel that they belong to each other. He showed her around with the matter-of-fact pride of a man who is not trying to impress but is sharing something he values, and she walked beside him through the cold and thought that she would like to come back here when it was spring and see what it looked like with the grass growing. On the 4th day, he walked her to the wagon. Pete Dawes had the good sense to be occupying himself with the horses at a significant distance. "Come back in April," Marshall said. "The spring market." "Yes, and because I want you to." He paused. "Catherine, yes. I'm going to tell you something plainly because I think you'd rather have that than something decorated. I would. I think about you every day. I'm in love with you. I haven't been certain how to say that without it being too much too fast, but I think you should know it." She looked at him. The February cold was sharp around them, and the light was that flat winter light, and he was looking at her with absolute steadiness, not performing bravery but actually being brave, which was different. "I think I'm in love with you too," she said. "I think I've been thinking about it for months, and that's what it is." "Then come back in April." "I'll come back in April." She drove south, and she was smiling for most of Kansas. The spring of 1874 was when things moved, because she had stopped holding herself at a cautious distance from what she felt and what she wanted. She wrote to Marshall through February and March, and the letters changed. They were still full of practical things, cattle and land and weather and the girls, but they were also full of what she had been careful not to say before, all the particular warmth of it, all the specific way that she found herself hoping for things she had thought she had stopped hoping for. In April she drove north again, this time with Nora and me, because she wanted them to be part of whatever this was becoming, because she was not the kind of woman who would build something in secret from her own children. Nora was 13 now, and had processed the concept of Marshall Boone with her characteristic calm over several weeks of conversation, arriving at a position of careful openness. Me, who was 9, had decided months ago that anyone who made her mother look different when she read letters was probably fine. Marshall met them at the market. He was waiting at the entrance, which he had clearly positioned himself to do, and when he saw her come through the gate with a girl on each side, something happened in his expression that Catherine saw and catalogued and held onto: a softening, a relief, a warmth that was not manufactured. He crouched down to speak to me first, which was the right instinct, because Me was younger and more likely to be unsettled by a large, unfamiliar man. He asked her name and she told him, and he said he'd heard about the riding lessons, and she said she was getting quite good, and he said he expected she was. Then he stood and looked at Nora, and Nora looked back at him with 12 going on 40, and he said, "You're the reader," and Nora said, "That's one way to describe me," and something in his expression acknowledged that she was going to be exactly as much as she clearly was, and that was fine with him. He looked at Catherine. She looked at him. Everything was in that look, all the letters and the supper and the February cold and the months of careful navigation. "Good drive?" he asked. "Good drive," she said. He stayed near them throughout the market day with the undemonstrative steadiness that was his particular character, helping where help was wanted and not inserting himself where it wasn't, answering Me's relentless questions about cattle and market procedure with patient accuracy, and managing to simultaneously give Nora the space she needed to observe him without pressure. Catherine watched all of this and felt the thing she felt for him rearrange itself into something more settled, something that had moved past the breathlessness of early feeling into the deeper and more sustainable territory of genuine conviction. Her herd sold well. $19 a head for a lot of 24, which was honest spring market money. The buyer shook her hand, and Marshall Boone was nowhere near the bidding and had nothing to do with it, which was important to her, and which she recognized that he understood was important to her. They had supper together, the four of them, in the hotel dining room, and it was an entirely different kind of supper than the ones before it. Me ate a great deal and asked Marshall how his sister was and whether she visited often, a question that clearly surprised him and that he answered with genuine interest in her inquiry. Nora asked whether the market prices were regulated by anyone or entirely speculative, and the conversation that followed was the most complex and engaged one Catherine had watched her daughter have with an adult other than herself, and she sat in the warm dining room and felt something settle in her chest with the solidity of something that intended to stay. After supper, with the girls put to bed at the boarding house, she and Marshall sat on the front porch of the boarding house in the spring darkness, and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that no is a complete answer and it won't change anything." "Ask," she said. "I want to court you properly. I want to come to Texas and meet your situation there and see if there's a future we could build together. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking if I can come." She thought about the 60 acres and the girls and the work still left to do and the mortgage she'd paid down and the spring that was coming with its demands and its possibilities. She thought about this man beside her, who had bid full price on her cattle without hesitation when no one else would, who had walked across a market floor to speak to her, who had written her letters for 8 months with the patient and honest correspondence of someone building something one word at a time, who had crouched down to talk to me about horses and listened to Nora like she deserved to be listened to. "Yes," she said, "come to Texas." He came in June. He rode south with 2 horses and a loaded saddlebag and arrived at her property on a Tuesday morning when the corn was growing well and the sky was very blue, and he dismounted at her gate and she came out of the house to meet him, and he said, "The land's better than I expected," and she said, "I told you it was good land," and he said, "You did." He stayed 2 weeks. He worked while he was there, because he was not the kind of man who visited a working ranch and sat in a chair, and because he recognized that his presence was most useful and least disruptive when it was contributing something. He helped Pete Dawes with the fencing project on the South Pasture, worked mornings and evenings on whatever needed doing, and spent the middle hours of the days in the company of Catherine and her daughters. He learned that Me had named every animal on the property, including the chickens, and that the naming system was both complex and non-negotiable. He learned that Nora had a system for organizing everything she read, and that she was currently working through a history of the eastern states that she had borrowed from the lending library, and that her opinion on the treatment of the Plains Indian nations was more sophisticated and more morally urgent than that of most adults he knew, which he told her directly, and which made her look at him with the expression of someone who has been seen. He learned that Catherine ran her property with a precision and a purposefulness that he found entirely admirable and slightly overwhelming, the kind of organized competence that made everything look easy because so much work had already gone into understanding the system. He also learned, in the evenings when the girls were in bed, and they sat on the porch together in the Texas dark with the fireflies moving through the grass and the sound of the land settling into nighttime, that Catherine was funny in a way she was careful about in public, that she had opinions about practically everything and had taught herself to express them only in appropriate company, and that she was lonely in a way she had nearly convinced herself was normal and sustainable, and that she was glad he was there in a way that she said directly and without decoration, which was one of the things he had come to most value about her. On his last evening there he took her hand in the dark and said, "I want to ask you to marry me, but I want to do it properly, and that means I want to ask Nora and me first if you'll allow me." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is, by a significant margin, the most correct thing you have said to me. I have my moments." She laughed, and he laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh genuinely, not the polite kind but the real kind, and it did something to her heart that she decided not to analyze but to simply feel. He spoke to Nora the following morning privately, while Me was feeding the chickens and Catherine was inside making a deliberate project of something in the kitchen. She watched through the window. He and Nora sat on the fence at the edge of the yard, and Nora listened with the focused attention she brought to everything important, and she asked questions that Catherine could not hear but could read in the shape of the conversation, and Marshall answered each one with his particular quality of direct regard. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. At the end of it, Nora nodded once, with the gravity of someone who has made a decision they intend to honor. He spoke to Me next, who was easier in the sense that Me's primary concern turned out to be whether Marshall had horses and whether she would be allowed to ride them, both of which he answered affirmatively, and Me hugged him around the middle with the sudden abandon of a 9-year-old who has decided something, which clearly startled him and which Catherine, watching from the doorway, thought was the best thing she had seen in a long time. He came to find her in the kitchen then, and he said, "Catherine," and she said, "Yes," and he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me if you're willing," and she said, "I've been waiting for you to get there," and he said, "Is that a yes?" and she said, "Yes, Marshall, that is most definitely a yes." He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her, and it was the first time, and it was everything she had known it would be. Not a beginning but a recognition, the particular feeling of arriving somewhere you have been heading for longer than you knew. They married in September of 1874, in the town nearest to her property, in a small church that smelled of wood polish and candle wax, on a Saturday when the Texas sky was the particular clear blue that it only achieves in autumn. Mrs. Prout from the neighboring farm was there, and Virgil was there in a clean shirt that looked like it was trying very hard, and Pete Dawes was there looking proud in the way of someone who feels they have had a small personal role in an outcome, and Nora and Me were there in the best dresses Catherine had been able to make for them, Me with flowers tucked into her braid, and Nora with the composure of someone who was trying to hold herself together and mostly succeeding. Marshall stood at the front of the church with his back straight and his hat in his hands, and his expression the one she had come to think of as his specific face for things that mattered deeply. And when she walked down the aisle with Me holding one hand and Nora on her other side, he looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been moving toward for a long time. The preacher said the words and they said the words back, and when the preacher said the husband may kiss the bride, Marshall Boone kissed Catherine Fletcher in front of God and the small congregation and Virgil's threatening tears and Me's undisguised excitement, and it was entirely right. They celebrated afterward at the boarding house, which Mrs. Hartley had decorated generously with the resources available to a boarding house in rural Texas, which were not many but were arranged with commitment. There was a cake that Me had been involved in making and was very proud of. There was music from a fiddle player who had been engaged from the town's one saloon for the afternoon. People danced on the cleared floor of the parlor, and Me dragged Marshall into the dancing with the confidence of someone who expects to succeed. And he danced with her with more competence than Catherine had anticipated, and a solemnity of expression that was the funniest thing she had seen all week. Nora danced with Pete Dawes, who was both honored and terrified, and with Virgil, who could not hear the music well but danced the steps he remembered from 40 years ago with great dignity. Catherine danced with her husband. She said that word in her mind, husband, and it fit differently than she had expected, not like reclaiming something lost, but like gaining something she had not quite known the shape of until she had it. They settled the question of the two properties over the weeks that followed. After long conversations and some negotiation, they decided to work both. Catherine's 60 acres in Texas was good land with a manageable mortgage and more potential than it had yet realized. And Marshall's ranch in Kansas was an established operation that needed attention. The practical solution, which they arrived at together in the way they arrived at everything, by talking it through honestly until the right answer became clear, was that Marshall would divide his time between the two, spending the seasons in Kansas when the cattle work demanded it and the rest in Texas, and that within a few years they would determine whether to consolidate or continue with both, depending on what the land and the market offered. It was not a simple arrangement, and it required more coordination and more trust than most people's domestic situations, but they were both people who were good at complex arrangements and very good at trust. Nora and Me stayed in Texas through the school year. This was non-negotiable for Catherine, and Marshall agreed immediately, because their education mattered and the school was there, and the roots that the girls had put down in that specific Texas soil were important and should not be pulled up for the sake of convenience. The first winter was the settling in time, and like all settling in times, it was not entirely smooth, because two people who have each spent years managing their own affairs and their own households have patterns that require negotiation and systems that require combining. And there are moments of friction and moments of confusion and moments of laughing at yourself, in the recognition of how stubborn you can be when you haven't had to account for another person in a while. There was the week in October when they had a genuine argument about the south pasture, fencing that Catherine had been planning a certain way for 2 years, and that Marshall had a different opinion about. And they argued about it with the full energy of two capable and opinionated people who each had evidence for their position, and eventually arrived at a combined approach that was better than either of their individual solutions, which was both satisfying and slightly irritating. There was the evening when Me could not find Marshall and went looking for him, and found him in the barn working quietly in the lamplight, and sat down in the hay to keep him company without saying anything for 20 minutes. And when Catherine came looking for both of them, she found them in comfortable silence together, and she stood in the barn doorway and felt something she could only call wholeness. There was the night when Nora, who had been watchful through all of this in the way she was watchful about everything, came to sit with Catherine at the kitchen table after dinner and said, "I think he's good." And Catherine said, "I think so too." And Nora said, "Papa would think so too, I think." And Catherine reached across the table and held her daughter's hand for a while, and neither of them needed to say anything else. By the spring of 1875, the shape of the new life had settled into something that worked, that felt genuinely like theirs. Marshall was in Texas through the cold months and the planting season, and he went north to the Kansas ranch in May for the summer, and Catherine came up with the girls in July for a month, and they worked the ranch together, and she saw what his place looked like in summer, as she had wanted to, the grass that grew long and green up to the fence lines, the cattle moving across the far pastures in the morning light, the house that was solid and well built, and that became, in the month she was there with her daughters, something warmer than it had been. She came back to Texas in August. Marshall came south again in September. The cattle market in Abilene saw her drive a herd north for the last time as a seller that fall, because the economics of the two operations were shifting in ways that made it more sensible to integrate. And the following year she and Marshall jointly trailed a combined herd and sold it together, which caused approximately nobody in the market to understand what they were looking at: a husband and wife working a cattle deal as full and equal partners. But which was simply what made sense to them and therefore what they did. In the market they were a unit. She knew the cattle. She knew the prices. She had been doing this for 3 years on her own, and her judgment was sharp and reliable. He had 10 years of Kansas market knowledge and a reputation that opened doors. Together, they got better prices than either would have gotten alone, and they both knew it, and it was one of the most satisfying things about the marriage. In the early months of 1876, Catherine realized she was pregnant. She told Marshall on a February evening in the kitchen in Texas, with the lamp burning warm and the winter dark outside the window, and she said it plainly and directly, which was how she said everything. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he put his hand over hers on the kitchen table and he said, "Are you well?" Which she recognized as the exact right first question, because it was not about his reaction but about her, and she said she was well, she was glad. She was nervous in the way of someone who has done this before and knows what it requires. He put his arms around her and held her, and she let herself be held, and they stood in the kitchen for a long time while the lamp burned and the Texas winter settled around the house. She told the girls the next morning at breakfast. Me went perfectly still for a moment, which was unusual enough to be notable, and then broke into a smile that took over her entire face. Nora looked at her mother with those dark knowing eyes and said, "How are you feeling?" which was 14 years old with entirely too much perception, and Catherine said fine truly, and Nora said good, and that was that. The baby was born in September of 1876, which was already a year full of news from the wider world, the celebrations of the centennial of the Republic, and also the terrible news from the Little Bighorn in June, which had reached them through the newspaper, and which Catherine had read with the complicated feelings of a woman who had been living in proximity to contested land long enough to have thoughts about contested land that were not simple. She had talked to Marshall about it and about the broader injustice of what was happening to the native peoples of the plains, people who had been on this land for centuries and were being driven from it by the same westward expansion that had allowed people like herself to claim a piece of it. These were not comfortable thoughts, and she did not resolve them, because some things are not meant to be resolved but to be held and reckoned with honestly, and that was how she tried to hold them. The baby was a boy. He came in the early morning of a September day when the light was just starting and the air was clean, and he was healthy and strong, and had his father's dark coloring and Catherine's jaw, and Marshall held him in the bedroom with a quality of stillness that was different from all his other kinds of stillness. And Catherine watched him hold their son, and felt the particular joy of a new thing that does not replace any old thing but simply adds to the world. They named him Thomas Boone, because she wanted to carry Thomas Fletcher's name forward in a way that honored what he had been, and Marshall had agreed without hesitation, which was the kind of man he was. Me cried when she held the baby, which surprised everyone including me, who said, "I didn't expect that," and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Nora held him with careful attention and looked at Catherine and said, "He looks like a person who is going to cause trouble," and Catherine laughed until she had to stop because of the stitching. Thomas Boone grew through the fall of 1876 into a round-cheeked, observant, generally agreeable baby, who slept better than either of his sisters had at the same age, and who was treated by me as a personal discovery. She intended to supervise closely. Marshall was present for all of it in the way he was present for everything consistently, practically, with a care that did not announce itself but simply was. They were in Texas that winter, all of them, and it was the first Christmas that had felt full in 2 years. Catherine made dinner and Marshall brought in wood, and Nora managed me's expectations about the gifts with the patient authority of an older sibling. And they sat around the table in the evening with the baby asleep in the bedroom, and the lamplight warm, and the sound of the land quiet and dark outside. And Catherine looked at the faces of the people at her table, her husband, her daughters. The first year of her son's life turning in the background, and felt something she had not entirely believed she would feel again. She felt like everything was where it was supposed to be. That did not mean it was easy. 1877 brought a dry summer that stressed the Texas land and required hard decisions about the cattle, and a disagreement with a neighboring property owner named Carver about a fence line that required Marshall to exercise more patience than he said he had, but more than he actually showed, which was characteristic of him. It brought about a fever for me that terrified Catherine for 3 days, and resolved on the fourth when me sat up and announced she was hungry, and Catherine sat beside her daughter's bed and held her hand for a long time afterward, saying a private and inarticulate thank you to whoever was listening. It brought a letter from Marshall's sister in Missouri saying she was hoping to come visit, which she eventually did in October, and she was a small, energetic woman named Ruth who took to Nora immediately and spent 3 days talking about books with her, which was one of the finer things Marshall had arranged without particularly meaning to. And it brought growth. The south pasture, properly fenced at last to Catherine's specifications, turned out to be as productive as she had believed it would be. The corn yield that fall was the best since Thomas had planted the field 3 years ago, and she stood at the edge of the field in the October light and felt the particular satisfaction of being right about your own land. By 1878, Nora was 15 and had begun to talk about school in a way that was not about the local schoolhouse, but about the possibilities beyond it. There were women's academies. There were institutions that were beginning, very slowly, to admit women to more complete forms of education, and Nora talked about them with the careful research of someone who has been thinking about this for a long time and has not said it out loud because she was not certain it was possible. Catherine and Marshall talked about it together and then talked about it with Nora, and what emerged from those conversations was a commitment specific and financial and serious, that Nora would have whatever education she could access and wanted, and that they would make the resources available. It would take a few more years. It was possible. Nora looked at them both across the kitchen table, with the self-containment that was her primary mode, and said, "Thank you." And Catherine saw her daughter's eyes fill very briefly with tears that she immediately managed back, which was so entirely Nora that she felt a kind of love for her that was specific to that gesture, to that exact combination of wanting and dignity. Me, who was now 13 and had moved through childhood with the cheerfulness of someone for whom the world was largely cooperating, had discovered that she had a genuine gift with horses, a real and technical understanding of them that went beyond enthusiasm. Marshall had been the one to see it first, had watched her working with one of the young horses on the Kansas ranch during a summer visit and said to Catherine, very quietly, "She has a feel for it. It's real." He had arranged for her to work with the man who trained his horses, a quiet and skilled Tejano horseman named Ramos who had come north with a cattle drive and stayed, and me had gone from enthusiastic to genuinely competent in the space of one summer, and was now at 13 handling horses, with a capability that Pete Dawes watched with open admiration. Thomas was 2 in the fall of 1878, walking everywhere with the aggressive confidence of a very small person who has discovered locomotion and intends to use it thoroughly. He had words now, more of them every week, and his vocabulary included Nora, me, Mama, and Pa, which was what he called Marshall, and which Marshall heard the first time with an expression that Catherine saw from across the room and that she knew she would remember. She found him later that evening in the barn doing something non-urgent with the harness, and she went in and stood beside him and said, "He called you Pa." And Marshall said, "Yes," and she said, "How does that feel?" And he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Like something I didn't know I needed." He looked at her. "Is that all right to say?" "It's exactly right to say," she said, and she put her hand on his arm and they stood in the barn in the quiet and the warmth of it, which was where they had some of their most important conversations, and she thought that this was what a life was supposed to feel like. Not simple, not without difficulty, but full, genuinely full in all directions. By the spring of 1879, 6 years had passed since that morning in the Abilene cattle market, and the life they had built had the depth and the detail of something that has been tended through multiple seasons. The Texas property was entirely paid off. The mortgage was gone, cleared with the proceeds of 2 good cattle seasons and 1 exceptional corn year, and the deed was Catherine's, which she had put in a box in the bureau with a satisfaction that had not diminished in the months since. The Kansas ranch was running well, managed in the summer months by a reliable foreman named Cal who had been with Marshall for 5 years, and who had come to know Catherine's judgment well enough to consult her by letter on decisions that didn't require Marshall's presence. Nora was 17 and had a packet of papers on her desk about a women's seminary in Missouri that had written back to her inquiry with a welcoming letter, and the decision about whether to go was not yet made, but was in active negotiation between her and her own desire, which was large, and her attachment to home, which was also large. And Catherine sat with her through those conversations and said what she thought honestly, which was that Nora should go, and that going was not leaving, and that the education was worth the distance, and that she would come home for the summers, and that home would be here. The conversation where Nora decided to go happened on a May evening on the porch, and when Nora said, "I've decided, I'm going," she looked at Catherine with 17 years old on her face and something much older behind it, and Catherine said, "I know," and held her daughter's hand, and it was one of the proudest and one of the hardest moments of her life. Marshall, informed at dinner, said, "Good. When do you need to leave?" And Nora looked at him with the expression she reserved for things she found unexpectedly right, and said, "July," and he said, "We'll make sure you're set before then." He personally arranged the transportation. He wrote to his sister Ruth in Missouri, who agreed to have Nora to stay for the first few weeks while she settled in, which was the kind of arranging that did not announce itself. Nora, when she found out, said, "You wrote to her about this before I'd even decided," and Marshall said, "I wrote to her about the possibility after your mother and I talked. It doesn't commit you to anything." Nora looked at him for a moment and said, "You're very good at this." He said, "At what?" She said, "At making sure people have options without making them feel managed." He said nothing, which was his version of thank you. Me was 16 in the summer of 1879, and was the person on the property with the clearest sense of what she was going to do with her life, which was work with horses. Ramos had suggested to Marshall that she had enough natural ability and enough developed skill that she could, if she chose, make a genuine livelihood of it, either in training or in breeding. And when this was conveyed to me, she went very quiet for a moment and then said, "That's what I want," with the simplicity of someone who has never doubted it but has been waiting for permission to say so. Catherine watched her younger daughter become certain of herself that summer with the bittersweet delight that parenthood offers, and that is impossible to fully explain to anyone who has not experienced it. Me had her father's cheerfulness and her mother's capability, and something entirely her own, a way of being in the world that was open and competent and never careless. And Catherine loved her with the specific love of a parent for the child who is most unlike them, and therefore most mysterious and most wonderful. Thomas, 3 years old in the fall of 1879, had recently become interested in cattle with the focused attention of a small boy who has decided on his subject. He followed Marshall around the ranch with a solemnity of purpose that made everyone who witnessed it want to laugh but not, because he was entirely serious about it. He asked questions constantly and remembered the answers and applied them later, which Marshall found both charming and somewhat alarming in a 3-year-old. He was Thomas Fletcher Boone, named for a man he would never know, and he was his father's son and his mother's son and his sister's brother, and he was growing up in a life that had 2 properties and 2 climates, and a family that was complicated and assembled from multiple origins and entirely his. Nora left for Missouri in July. She was packed and ready with her books in a trunk and her mind already partially there, the way people are when they are truly ready for the next thing. Catherine drove her to the railway station in the nearest town with Marshall beside her, and me came, and Thomas came because he was 3 and therefore went everywhere. At the station, Nora hugged me first, which was the hug of sisters who have shared a childhood and know how the other smells and the particular texture of each other's hair. She hugged Thomas, who was solemn about it in the way he was solemn about important things. She shook Marshall's hand, and then, with a precision and a care that was entirely her own, she put her arms around him and held on for a moment, which was as close to effusive as Nora got, and which clearly meant something significant to him, though his expression remained composed. She hugged Catherine last, and the hug was long, and Catherine held her daughter and smelled her hair and thought of her at 12 with her arms crossed at the Abilene cattle market, and at 8 crying for her father, and at 17 standing at a train station with her whole intelligent life ahead of her. And she held all of those versions of Nora in the hug, and then let her go. Nora boarded the train. She found a window seat and looked out at them on the platform with her serious face, and when the train began to move she lifted her hand in a wave that was entirely Nora, measured, dignified, and unmistakably full of feeling. Catherine watched until the train was gone. She felt Marshall's hand take hers. "She'll do brilliantly," he said. "I know she will," Catherine said. "That doesn't make it smaller." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She turned and found that me was already occupied with Thomas, who had declared the train very large, and was now demanding a thorough explanation of steam engines, which me was providing with good-natured patience. Catherine looked at her family assembled on the station platform in the Texas summer heat, and felt, not for the first time, the specific gratitude of a person who has been given a second chance and understood how to use it. They drove home through the flat Texas landscape, Thomas eventually asleep against me's shoulder in the wagon bed, and the land opened out around them golden and dry and full of distance, and the sky was enormous the way it always was here, and Catherine drove with Marshall beside her on the seat and the evening coming on slowly, and she thought about how it had started, the cattle market, the morning bid, the man who paid full price and said nothing else, and how that single moment of unexpected grace had been the first note of everything that followed. She had not needed saving. She had never needed saving. She had been managing and would have continued to manage, because that was who she was and what she was made of. But he had seen her, actually seen her, in the crowd of people who were looking through her or past her or around her, and he had made a gesture that cost him money and asked for nothing in return. And that had been, she understood now, the truest expression of who he was, a man of principle who acted on what he believed without performing the action. She had loved Thomas Fletcher, and she loved him still in the way that you carry someone who has shaped you, in the way that someone who is gone continues to occupy a place in the structure of who you are. She loved Marshall Boone with the love that had grown in her since that first market morning, a love that had been built deliberately and carefully and fully, a love that had her daughter's blessing and her own hard-won certainty. "What are you thinking about?" Marshall asked. "The market," she said. "When we first met, you bid $24. The cattle were worth it." "They were worth 18, she said, because she was still not going to pretend otherwise. "Maybe 20. I thought they were worth 24. She looked at him. His profile was familiar to her now in the way that things become familiar when you have seen them in every light, in winter and summer, early morning and late evening, in good days and difficult ones. She knew the exact angle of that jaw and the particular way he looked when he was thinking hard about something, and the shape of his hands and the quality of his silence and the rare and real sound of his laugh. "I never properly thanked you for that," she said. "For the way you did it. For not making it anything except a transaction." "It was a transaction," he said. "No, it wasn't," she said, "and we both know that." He was quiet. The wagon moved through the golden evening, Thomas breathing softly in the back, me humming something. "No," he said after a while, "it wasn't just a transaction." He glanced at her. "But I didn't know what it was yet." "Neither did I," she said, "but I knew it was something." "So did I." The horse moved steadily on the road home. The evening was coming in beautiful and slow, the way Texas evenings could be. All the light going amber and the shadows stretching long, and the whole enormous sky cycling through its colors. Home was another hour's drive. The house that was hers and his and their children's, the south pasture, the kitchen with the table she had sat at so many evenings working out how to keep going. She put her hand over his on the seat between them, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they drove home in the falling light. And the life they had built continued forward in the way that good lives do, with difficulty and joy in turns, with seasons that were hard and seasons that gave back generously, with letters from Nora in Missouri describing her studies, with the controlled enthusiasm of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be, with me growing into a young woman whose work with horses was becoming known beyond the county, with Thomas becoming a boy who could ride before he started school, and who was going to be, Catherine suspected, entirely too much like his mother, which she found purely delightful. Marshall was 50 when Thomas started school, and he had the solidity of a man who has built something he believes in and tends it with full attention. Catherine was 41, and she had the authority of a person who has survived and chosen and fought for what mattered, and she carried it with the particular grace of someone who knows exactly who she is. They were partners in every sense of the word, in the land and the cattle and the decisions and the evenings on the porch and the arguments about fence lines and the unguarded moments when the day was over, and the children were quiet, and there was nothing to do but be in the same space together, which was still, after 7 years, one of the things she liked best. She had come to that market in the spring of 1873 with 32 scrawny longhorns and no illusions about what awaited her, and she had come back from it with a payment draft and the beginning of something she had not expected, and she had built it carefully and deliberately, and with everything she had, and it was good. It was genuinely and solidly good. On the evening of their 7th anniversary, they sat on the porch in the September dark, and the air smelled like the season turning, and Thomas was asleep in the house, and me was in the barn checking on a young horse that had been fretful, and Nora was in Missouri writing what she had written to them about as possibly being her first published essay in an academic journal, which was a sentence that Catherine could not read without something happening in her chest that she suspected would never stop. 7 years, Marshall said. "It doesn't feel like 7 years," she said. "It feels like both longer and shorter. That's how I know it's been good." She turned to look at him. He was looking out at the dark yard, where the fireflies were still moving in the grass, late for the season, a last gathering before the cold. His face in the dark was familiar in a way that she had come to think of as home in the most literal sense, not a place but a face, the thing she oriented toward. "I'm glad you bid on my cattle," she said. He looked at her. That slight expression around the eyes that she had learned to read as warmth, as amusement, as the real thing underneath all his composure. "I'm glad you came to the market," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and they sat in the warm Texas evening, and the fireflies moved, and the land was quiet, and Thomas slept inside, and me moved in the barn, and Nora was 3 states north becoming whoever she was going to be. And everything that had been broken was not unbroken, because the breaking had happened and was part of the story. But everything that had been broken had become the foundation of something more enduring than what was there before. The way bone heals stronger at the break, The way land that has been worked through a hard year gives more the year after. This was her life. This was the life she had made from the wreckage of the one she'd lost, made deliberately and with full understanding of what she was choosing, made with the help of a man who had understood from the very first moment that the most respectful thing he could do was to treat her as a person capable of her own decisions while quietly, firmly, and with complete consistency making sure the terms were fair. She had come to that market prepared to be swindled. She had not been swindled. She had been seen. Everything else had followed from that. The evening settled around them, warm and final and full of the particular piece of a day that has been lived well coming to its close. And Catherine Fletcher Boone sat on the porch of her paid-for Texas home with her husband's hand in hers and felt, with the certainty of someone who has learned the difference between hoping and knowing, that this was where she was supposed to be.